Good evening, everyone. My name is Celeste Lacabra. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I wanted to do a rather in-depth analysis of Werner Herzog's documentary, GRIZZLY Man. I watched it for the second time recently, and I still haven't been able to stop thinking about it in the few days that have passed since I rewatched it. So I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about it and why I love it so much. This is going to be my own personal thoughts and interpretations on the film. I don't have any intentions of telling you how to feel about the film or how to interpret it. This is just what I got out of it personally and what it means to me. So I guess before we get started, I should say that I will be spoiling the film in so much as that's even something I can do. I don't really believe in spoilers for documentaries, especially ones about subject matter this heavy. But obviously, if you want to go into the film completely blind, you probably should skip the video until you've seen it. So the reason that I rewatched this recently was because, one, it's one of my favorite films ever made, I think. It's just truly incredible. And two, it's because the Last Picture Show podcast did an episode on it, and I was like, oh, I love that film. Let me listen to this. And just listening to them talk about it and thinking about it, again, I couldn't get it out of my head, and I just had to rewatch it. So luckily it was free on YouTube, because there isn't a Blu-ray of it, and I found it just as much, if not even more, compelling and emotional than I did the first time. I had a hard time going to bed because it was so deeply ingrained in my mind, and the entire next day it wouldn't leave my brain, and clearly it still hasn't fully left because I've written out a script and I'm going to be talking about it for quite a while. So I guess before we get into my personal analysis, I wanted to give a quick plot summary of what happens in the film. So basically, Werner Herzog set out to make a documentary about Timothy Treadwell, and specifically his last days that he was alive, or the last years that he was alive. Timothy Treadwell is a person who has lost touch with modern society, and he needs to connect with nature. He is what he calls a bear enthusiast, to the point where he believes he has personal relationships with the bears that he lives with and comes in contact with, and he believes that he could become a bear himself. Not physically maybe, but certainly spiritually, he believes that he can become one of them. The way he accomplishes this is he camps out for entire summers over the course of years to document and live among the bears. His stated reasoning for doing this is that he wants to educate people about bears, and he wants to save the bears from, poachers and the park rangers. One year, the inevitable happens as he becomes less careful, and he is eaten by a bear along with his girlfriend. This horrific incident is painfully detailed in the film, but the audio footage of the incident is never heard and has never been released to this day. Timothy Treadwell had hundreds of hours of footage that he filmed over the years, and we'll never know exactly how or why, but the camera was rolling while he died. Herzog says that the lens cap was off, and that's why there's no video, but the sound exists. So Herzog combed through and edited over 100 hours of Timothy's footage and conducts interviews with rangers, experts, friends, and family in an attempt to make sense of Timothy's life and death. So that's a quick overview of just the surface level of what happens in the film, but now let's get into my analysis and what I think the whole thing means. So the first thing I wanted to point out is that the framing of the narrative is really interesting to me. Herzog frames it as a conversation between Timothy and himself, which I think is a really interesting angle to take when approaching a documentary. Herzog, throughout the film, exercises his own fascination and his own relationship with obsession to a dead person who he's never met and he will never meet. I find this framing to be especially interesting because it's a conversation that is technically one-sided and is actually impossible to complete. Herzog relates to Timothy in both his attempts at documentary filmmaking and the obsessive nature with which Timothy approaches his subjects. These are things that Herzog has done literally. He's made many documentary films, but obsession is a huge theme in his filmography and in his approach to filmmaking. Okay, so now that I've covered the ways that Herzog seems to relate to Timothy, I wanted to talk about the ways that I personally relate to Timothy and his story. The primary thing that I find relatable is his complete and utter love of animals and his devotion to them. When you see him on screen interacting with these animals and talking about these animals, his love and his joy is so infectious and it's so relatable to me. The way he is with bears especially reminds me of the way that I am with my own cats. He talks to them, he has conversations with them like they're people, and he talks to them as equals. He doesn't talk down to them, he doesn't assume that they, or, act as if they don't understand what he's saying. He just talks to them like he would any other person, like a close confidant even. And he considers them his friends. I relate to this a lot. I talk to my own animals. I have conversations with my cats all the time, and I consider them to be my friends. They're like a part of my family and a huge part of my life. And seeing him relate to wild animals in the same way that I relate to my own cats was something that really spawned a lot of introspection and was the primary way in which I related to him. His stated desire to help and save the bears is, I think, a goal that is admirable at its core as well. Another thing that I admire about Timothy is his insistence on not charging the schools that he lectures at. People close to him testify to the fact that he basically lived in near poverty his whole adult life. And to me, this shows a commitment to his principles, as flawed as they may be, rather than any kind of cynical ploy for money. There's arguably a cynical ploy for fame, but not for money, and I find that admirable. Okay, so with the shorter list of ways that I relate to Timothy out of the way, let's talk about where I can't relate to him. He has a strong and burning desire to live in the wild and completely separate himself to society. This is something that is completely foreign to me. I've never once enjoyed camping in my life, and the idea of living in nature is really just horrific to me, and so at odds with who I am as a person and how I live my life. I too find myself very disappointed with society and the way it's going, and I find myself unable to relate to people sometimes. But I still have less than no desire to live by myself in the woods. That kind of Thoreau-esque desire to completely separate myself from society and just live off the lam and disregard every comfort and every beautiful thing about modern society is something that I simply can't relate to. He also seems to have a very deep detachment to women. He has girlfriends on and off, but when he's by himself, the way he speaks to them clearly betrays an inability to relate to or understand other people, but especially women. I think he possibly has some personal misogyny that has gone unexamined his whole life, and he probably could have done with some introspection as to why it is he has such trouble relating to women. I think the biggest way that Timothy and I differ, and I struggle to relate to him, is his complete and consistent disconnection between domesticated and wild animals. He treats bears the same way that he or you or I would treat a dog or a cat. But what he seems to fail to realize is that there's a very good reason why we can coexist with cats and dogs and not with grizzly bears. Timothy seems not to understand this, and to be honest, I think that's by choice. I think he chooses to ignore this very obvious fact and tries to replace it with a narrative that he's crafted about himself. That he's the only one that can really see through these animals and sees them for what they are, and that he's different than the others, and that he can take care of them and he can save them. Like I said, I think it comes from an admirable place, but at the end of the day, I think it's deeply misguided and maybe willfully ignorant. It really borders on delusion, to be honest with you. Werner Herzog seems to come to the same conclusion, and in one of my favorite quotes of the film, he kind of summarizes this disconnect between the two of them with this quote. Quote, "And what haunts me is that in all the faces of all the bears that Treadwell ever filmed, I discover no kinship, no understanding, no mercy. I see only the overwhelming indifference of nature. To me, there is no such thing as a secret world of the bears. And this blank stare speaks only of a half-bored interest in food. But for Timothy Treadwell, this bear was a friend, a savior." End quote. I spared you my attempt at his accent, but I think that that's a really poignant and elegant way of framing the difference between how Timothy and how Herzog, and by extension, I think the average person, sees a dangerous wild animal. Now, I don't want it to sound like I think that animals are just heartless, emotionless food machines or something like that. I do believe that animals that we've domesticated can and do form bonds and relationships with human beings. But I think that that's because of generations of breeding, association, etc. I don't think that wild animals have that same bond forged in their DNA, and I don't think you can just force your way into a wild animal's heart. Now, I will say that as a vegan, as an ethical vegan, I really do strongly identify with Timothy's sadness and grief at the death and loss of these animals. However, that point of identity comes with some large caveats. He seems to fail to understand the difference between people with moral agency needlessly killing animals and wild animals eating each other to survive. He seems to put these two on the same moral plane and assigns the same level of grief to each. When he finds himself thinking about poachers and when he comes to terms with an animal that has died of natural causes, his reactions seem to be very similar, if not the same. I think that part of why he goes to nature is that he seeks the compassion that he can't find in humanity, but he only finds cold cruelty and indifference. Okay, so now that I've kind of gone through the ways in which I relate to and don't relate to Timothy, I wanted to talk about Herzog's, and really by extension, my final assessment of Timothy's worldview, because I found myself agreeing with a lot of the things that Herzog had to say. I think Herzog attempts to understand Timothy's worldview, but ultimately he can't, and he's not shy about voicing his disagreements. A quote towards the end of the film was probably the one that I found the most relatable and the most profound, and it reads as follows, quote, "I believe the common denominator of the universe is not harmony, but chaos, hostility, and murder," end quote. I really do find myself agreeing with this. I think Timothy went into nature expecting to find some kind of harmony, some kind of balance, some kind of moral arc that he was unable to find in human society. However, that's just not a reality of what nature looks like. If anything, it's worse. And it's partly why I don't believe in God. The suffering of nature is simply immeasurable. A lot of attention is rightly focused on human suffering, but the bitter cruelty of the wild animal's life experience is almost exclusively filled with pain, hunger, and fear. There's a part in the film where the animals have been without water for a considerable period of time, and thus they're unable to find any fish, and are starving, and are having to eat their own young. There's a scene where Timothy is in his tent, and he's heartbroken by this, and he's screaming and begging to God to finally give them the storm that they need so that the animals can eat. But unfortunately, as the storm rages on in Timothy's tent and the animals starve, Timothy rages and grovels to a God that either cannot or will not listen to him. So next, I kind of want to go into my final assessment of what the film accomplishes. I believe that this is more of a character study of a deeply flawed and lost man than it is a nature documentary or an exploitative exercise in gawking at bloodshed and folly. Timothy is clearly more driven by his search for meaning and his own disillusionment with society than by any true altruistic or charitable motivations. He brushes off sensible advice, he needlessly antagonizes park rangers, and in a really telling scene, he never acts in the one opportunity he has to actually confront potential poachers. Some people show up and they throw rocks at his beloved bears, and he hides and cowers and films them and whines about how cruel they are and how he needs to stop them. And at several points he says to himself, that's it, that's the last straw, I gotta do something. But eventually he realizes that he can't show himself, and he won't show himself. And thus, the purpose of his mission falls apart. He also endangers himself and ends up getting himself, his girlfriend, and 2 bears killed in a tragically ironic end to his story. His fatal encounter with bears is caused directly by a negative experience with his re-entry into society and flagrantly flies in the face of his own safety standards. So as the film goes into, he went to the airport and had a bad experience with a person there, and rather than pushing through that and going home, he decided to just go right back into the forest. Now the problem with this is that he's typically used to a very specific land at a very specific time, which meant that he got to know the bears, he got to know their tics, and what made them angry. He learned how to be safe around these bears. It was also a period of time in which they had plenty to eat. But when he goes back, a lot of those bears that he was friends with, quote unquote friends with, were already in hibernation, and all that was left was bears that he was unfamiliar with, that had come in from other parts of the forest, who were solely interested in food. He placed himself and his tent in a spot that was deliberately closer to the bears than was safe, and farther from a place that he would have been found. I think all this goes to show that he was clearly clinging on to a feeling and a story that he had written about himself, rather than any rational call to action. A piece of the story that a lot of people rightly put a lot of focus on is the story of his girlfriend. Now, unfortunately, there's not much that we can say about her, and there's not a lot to go on when analyzing how and why she died. To me, it's difficult to say how much blame should actually be assigned to Timothy for her death. She seems intentionally left out of the footage, and her parents have no interest in participating in the documentary. So all we really get is a couple murmurings from friends saying that she was afraid of bears, and her clear devotion to him as she doesn't leave as he's being attacked. When discussing his girlfriend, I think a lot of people maybe unintentionally remove her agency by solely blaming him for what happened to her. But at the end of the day, I do see that he was a very charismatic and persuasive figure. I don't know how much manipulation was involved, and I don't know what caused her to decide to return to the bears when it was clearly too dangerous. What I do understand is why she decided to stay once she was back in the forest. She had comparatively little experience in survival and probably just needed a friend and somebody to cling to in the face of so much fear and danger. And there wasn't much she could do by herself at that point. It's very likely true that Timothy should have known better and not allowed her to risk her life and come with him, but at the end of the day, it is her decision, and it's a nuanced and thorny aspect of the story that the public will likely never really fully understand. In conclusion, I kind of want to talk about the very end of the film. The ending song, it's called Coyotes, is always so emotional for me when I see it. And it's a perfect way to conclude the film, I think. It perfectly encapsulates the spirit of a man who is fundamentally incompatible with modern society. He is a piece of a larger puzzle that cannot or will not fit, and he dies to finally feel whole. Okay, those are my thoughts on Grizzly Man. I obviously highly recommend that you check it out. To me, it's a perfect 10 out of 10. It might be my favorite documentary of all time. It really grips me in a way that most films can't. So that's all from me. I would love to hear your thoughts on the film and any constructive criticism or critiques you have of my analysis. I'd love to start a conversation in the comments below about this wonderful film. So yeah, if you would please give me a like on the video, it would help me out a lot in helping my videos get found. And I'm trying to hit my first 100 subscribers, so if you could please subscribe, that would mean the world to me. That's everything from me today. There's links in the description if you want to follow me on Letterboxd or on Instagram. And that's it. I love you very much, and I hope that your day ends better than it started.